In the last lecture module, we got through the first 5 of the 6 criteria and considered the notion of relativizing those criteria. In this module, we'll turn our attention to the 6th criterion that Alvin proposes, why he rejects it, and then we'll deal with his positive proposal as well. So the 6th criterion, a DDP is right if and only if it is the proper DDP to choose if one chooses a DDP from the internal standpoint. Alvin wants to claim that this particular DDP is unfulfillable. So he says, I argue that even if 6 is a condition that satisfactorily expresses the spirit of internalism, it does not select or determine a preferred DDP. In this sense, the internalist conception of a right doxastic decision principle is unfulfillable. So why would that be? Well, choice of a DDP requires a criterion of choice, and this brings the threat of a regress. A principle guiding the choice of DDP would be a proposition requiring justification. Likewise, one would need a criterion for choosing one's choice principle. So one seems to need doxastic attitudes, an infinite number, to make a choice among DDPs. Now, I think this is actually a real problem for the internalist. However, Alvin thinks it's only an apparent problem, not a real problem. He instead focuses on the following. You might claim that a DDP is not a proposition but a policy. Even if you claim that, you still need doxastic attitudes to make such a choice, even amongst policies. In particular, you're going to need beliefs like beliefs in contingent propositions, such as the outcomes of the various rules that you're choosing amongst, and so on. And they're being justified, being a legitimate basis for making that choice. That's disallowed by the internalist conception if we do not first have a DDP. So even if the principle of choice needn't be a belief, we require beliefs to apply the principle. And Alvin says in page 39, more specifically, doxastic neutrality is required prior to the choice of a DDP. So the internal standpoint must disallow the use of or appeal to prior doxastic attitudes we may happen to have. And this, I think, is the real crux of the paper itself. Alvin introduces the certifiability criterion as part of the internalist project, but the certifiability criterion is really impossible to satisfy, precisely because what it requires is that from your own subjective perspective, you're capable of having determinate insight into whether or not a DDP, in fact, as a point of objective reality, satisfies or optimizes or in some other way promotes the goal of cognition. And so in this way, it's like our initial problem with the regress argument. It's a problem of how do I actually manage to inject justification into the belief edifice in the first place? How is it that I can form beliefs in a way that somehow is governed by that kind of insight that that belief as formed, in fact, corresponds to reality? Now, in this paper, what Alvin's done is taken that basic conundrum, that basic difficulty that we've been looking at for a while, and he transposes it over to the very criterion for making those sorts of decisions. And in this way, the paper is sort of novel. In a way, though, the paper is really a replication of the Cartesian circle argument, the idea that in order to have knowledge of the external world, you need some means of guaranteeing that your beliefs formed in accordance with subjectively accessible criterion are also objectively correspondent to the real world. And this was where people who accused Descartes of circular reasoning say your argument for the existence of God is really just based upon a criterion for what counts as a justified belief in your system, clear and distinct, a revelation of the natural light, things of this nature, none of which can actually be used to justify beliefs until you establish the existence of God, the means by which you're guaranteeing that those subjective indicators of correspondence with reality are in fact objective relationships between reality and your beliefs. Having completed his argument against the internalist project, he just wants to cross a few T's and dot a few I's before completing his negative thesis and then turning to his positive thesis. He turns to an objection or a criticism that his results depend upon adopting a decision principle called maximizing expected value. Maximizing expected value would tell you to make those decisions that maximize the number of true beliefs and minimize the number of false beliefs. But he notes that you fare no better with the other common principles from decision theory, like maxi-max and maxi-min. Maxi-min tells us to choose the DDP with the best of the worst outcomes. That is the one that minimizes false beliefs the most. And that, he says, would just result in our being skeptical about everything. Maxi-max tells us to choose the DDP with the best of the best outcomes. That is, with the most true beliefs. And he says maxi-max would likely just lead us to adopt a policy of gullibility, to maximize our true beliefs by believing everything. Where still, he thinks, all of these principles require doxastic states, beliefs about the subjective probabilities of the outcomes of these beliefs in order to choose them, and so on. He says you might also claim that truth generation and error avoidance isn't the best candidate for the goal of cognition. So recall these DDPs are trying to urge us towards justified beliefs that satisfy the goal of cognition. But he says other candidates aren't going to fare any better. They're probably worse. So things like coherence or relieving agnosticism. Both of these have their own problems. Coherence, he says, remains either too vague or just seemingly wrong, or leads back to truth through consistency or explanatory coherence. Believing agnosticism would seem to urge us on towards gullibility all over again. So he ends the paper with a positive claim. And the positive claim is that unlike internalism, externalism doesn't preclude the discovery of a right DDP by, for example, bootstrapping. So how does this go? Well, Goldman wants to claim that, look, if we adopt instead of a regulative notion, the theoretical notion of justification, and then we don't adhere to the certifiability or discovery criterion, then we can have a goal articulated by our theory, and then we can have evidence, including evidence from within our internalist subjective perspective as to whether or not various DDPs in fact satisfy this theoretical and not regulative notion in formulating our regulative notion of justification. And so he says that in the remainder of the paper, he wants to argue that externalism is the best choice, in fact, for choosing a right DDP. The obvious objection he notes is that it violates the discoverability, certifiability criterion. But using an external property doesn't mean that it's impossible to choose the correct or optimal DDP. He says nothing prevents us from getting the optimal DDP. In fact, we may come close. One might also object that if we don't have the optimal DDP, then how could it be possible for us to regularly make epistemic appraisals? But making epistemic appraisals could be made relative to the theoretic conception, not necessarily relative to the regulative conception. So these are beliefs about justifiedness, not necessarily facts. Furthermore, they could be negative or reflect a partial understanding of our total DDP. So how might we go about doing this? Well, he adopts a naturalistic perspective. He says, look, we're not just going to wait until an optimal DDP jumps out at us. What we find is the most plausible candidate for understanding how it is that we engage in our epistemic activities is that we have a set of native doxastic habits, and we form beliefs in accordance with those native doxastic habits. Some of them might be fixed and incapable of being revised or reconsidered. Others might actually be capable of being revised, reconsidered, and as a result, we may be able to modify them in a way that allows us to ascend from our native doxastic habits into more optimal DDPs. This overall map for how to go about improving our epistemic practices is often referred to as bootstrapping, as pulling ourselves up by the bootstraps, starting from a suboptimal position, but modifying that suboptimal position successively over and over again until we get to a much more optimal situation.